The Coronavirus Files, Part 3. Today, who's responsible for the coronavirus? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and problem news with a distinctively Australian flavour. In the third part of our series, Salvatore Babones is going to talk further about his research relating to the origins of the virus and how it was handled. Hello there, Ian.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's great to see you. And, picking up our conversation from the other day, you made the point at the end of the last conversation that the World Health Organization is sort of right there in the center. And you've got some observations about what they did and how they did it.
Well, if you go to the World Health Organization website today, you will find that the World Health Organization still advises against travel restrictions. Amazingly, it says that we should not be imposing travel restrictions in response to the coronavirus. And that has been its consistent advice ever since its first bulletins back in January. That advice has been, need I say, entirely the product of the World Health Organization's capture by China. In the early days of the epidemic, countries were talking about cutting travel from Wuhan and then cutting travel from China in general. And China strongly pressured the WHO to advise against any form of travel restrictions. Ironically, that travel advice remains on the WHO website, despite the fact that China itself has now, since late March, imposed travel restrictions on the rest of the world. So there's nobody listening to the WHO, not even its Chinese paymasters.
I'm interested in your comment about the relationship between the World Health Organization and China. I'd like to unpack that a bit more because I think that's a really important point you make.
China has had a program of taking over international organizations, and the World Health Organization has been top of its list. Since 2007, China has effectively controlled the top echelons of the World Health Organization. In 2007, it pushed mightily to get its own candidate, Margaret Chan, installed as Director General. Now, the Director General of the World Health Organization is elected from among the representatives from the entire world. And of course, China has a lot of influence among especially poorer countries. Now, in 2007, it pushed the WHO director has always been a European or an American. We want someone from Asia. It wanted its candidate. It rallied Asian and African countries around its candidate. It got Margaret Chan. Margaret Chan was, all I can say is that her performance was not very good. She had a series of corruption scandals at the WHO. There were stories of people flying first class around the world to attend WHO conferences based on money that was supposedly donated for AIDS and Ebola relief in Africa. It was a financial and administrative disaster. But she was Chinese, had the full support of China, and was elected based on their pressure. Now, in 2017, the election came up again. And in 2017, the World Health Organization moved to a strictly one country, one vote voting system, where the World Health Assembly, representing all the countries of the world, would simply elect a leader. So one country, one vote means one thing: Africa, because Africa has more than 40 countries in one continent. I mean, Africa, with a population the same as India, has 40 times the votes of India at the World Health Organization, which is fair enough. I mean, it's like the UN General Assembly, a country's a country. Well, China has been spending money like crazy in Africa, trying to buy influence among African countries. And in 2017, those bills came due. And China pushed for, an African to head the World Health Organization, but not just any African, Tedros Adhanom, who was the former foreign minister of Ethiopia. Ethiopia has become kind of China's colony in Africa. I mean, Ethiopia has a parliament building built by China. It has an African Union building built by China. It has actually the African Centers for Disease Control building in Addis Ababa, built by China. Addis Ababa has become the transportation gateway between the African continent and China. In fact, Ethiopia's airlines were they still don't, I think, have any restrictions on travel to China. They left open their China routes when every other airline in the world was closing China routes. Ethiopia kept them open because Ethiopia is Well, under the thumb of China. I mean, even the mass transit system in Addis Ababa was built by China as an aid project. Well, China got Tedros Adhanom elected Director General of the World Health Organization. Adhanom is not a doctor. All the previous heads of the World Health Organization, as you would expect, would be medical doctors. Adhanom does have a doctorate in community health. Which, not to despise it, but is, like my own doctorate in sociology, a social science degree. It is not a medical degree. Adhanom has been pushing the Chinese line right from the beginning of the coronavirus epidemic. He went to China early on. He gave press conferences in China in which he praised the Chinese leadership. He said China was doing everything to save the world from the coronavirus. He praised their lockdowns of entire cities, the aggressive measures being taken in China. The WHO, but especially its director, have been entirely beholden to China throughout. We even had the embarrassing spectacle of the World Health Organization's chief epidemiologist taking a question from a Taiwanese reporter and pretending not to hear it because he was under orders, apparently, not to recognize Taiwan. The World Health Organization, of course, excludes Taiwan. Now, the World Health Organization, right from the beginning, tried to downplay the seriousness of the virus, recycled official Chinese guidance all the time, didn't question what was coming out of China at all, and took the Chinese line right from the beginning of the crisis.
And I guess that means that the influence that has spread through the system influenced a lot of other decisions in other countries, because a lot of people in other countries were relying on World Health Organization guidance to shape their own responses.
Right. And the guidance is the crucial thing. Bizarrely, throughout January and February, the World Health Organization repeatedly issued travel guidance that said China should lock exit from China, make sure nobody infected boards a plane, that China is right to lock down its population, restrict travel across provinces. But their advice to the rest of the world in the very next paragraph of this same document was travel restrictions are unwarranted. We believe temperature checks at airports are ineffective. There's no way to prevent travelers entering with coronavirus, so it shouldn't be attempted. Now, call me crazy, but the World Health Organization was saying China can effectively prevent the exit of coronavirus, so no one else has to worry about preventing the entry of coronavirus. On top of that, they said entry restrictions were ineffective. Well, how can entry restrictions be ineffective if exit restrictions supposedly are effective? The only way to interpret that contradictory advice is China was saying, we'll handle the coronavirus. The world should simply trust us. The World Health Organization simply recycled that advice coming straight out of China. And unfortunately, even Australian Health Protection Principal Committee and its chief medical officer, Brendan Murphy, again repeated that World Health Organization advice. They issued statements saying that travel restrictions are not a public health measure. They issued statements saying Australia should rely on China to prevent the export of coronavirus instead of putting restrictions on the import of coronavirus. That is, Australia's health establishment simply bought the WHO line. Maybe knowing, maybe more worryingly, not knowing that line was coming straight from Beijing.
Right. So I guess that raises two interesting questions. The first question, of course, there's going to be a review at some point of the whole coronavirus episode. Is that review going to be worth anything if it's going to be completely scrambled around the World Health Organization and China?
Well, that review is going on right now at the Australian Senate and the COVID-19 committee. The problem is that the committee has been focused almost entirely on the domestic handling of the coronavirus inside Australia and hasn't really been focusing on the foreign affairs component of it. Now, the Morrison government has, to its credit, very actively sought an international committee or an international investigation into the coronavirus. They got more than 100 countries to co-sponsor a resolution at the World Health Assembly, which is the governing body behind the World Health Organization, calling for an independent investigation. And they got it. In fact, China signed on to the resolution and eventually became a co-sponsor of this resolution calling for an independent investigation. What most people didn't notice is that inserted into the language of that resolution for an independent investigation was the note that such an investigation might take advantage of existing World Health Organization procedures. In other words, the WHO is going to be allowed to investigate itself. And that is not going to result in any kind of investigation at all.
Right. So it's basically going through the motions, but don't expect too much. And then the other question, of course, is the US has basically said they're withdrawing funding from the World Health Organization. Now, is that connected with their view that, what you've said is that the World Health Organization is effectively captured by China, or is it something else?
Oh, absolutely. Donald Trump sent a letter to Tedros Adhanom, the Director General of the World Health Organization, enumerating the many failures of the World Health Organization and strongly drawing a line, a connection between the WHO and China, saying that the United States would not support an organization that has effectively become an agent of Chinese Communist Party influence. And I think Donald Trump was right to attempt to cut funding. Now, I don't know what the legal situation is with Congress and how much he can do unilaterally, how much requires congressional involvement, but the sentiment is certainly correct. I mean, most of the funding that the U.S. gives to the World Health Organization is actually intended for specific programs to address specific diseases, river blindness and tuberculosis. The question there becomes, is the WHO the right vehicle for that funding? Now, I still want to see the U.S. deeply involved in trying to solve the health problems, especially of the poorest countries of the world. And the U.S. will continue to be involved in infectious disease monitoring and in attempting to treat and cure infectious diseases. The question is, should that be done through the World Health Organization as an apparatus? And I think, based on what we've seen, not just in the coronavirus crisis, this is the nail in the coffin. In the SARS epidemic, now in the throughout the 2000s with the corruption scandals and the travel expenses scandals of the World Health Organization, the organization simply is not fit for purpose. It's kind of like the UN's Human Rights Council. Once you have Iran, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Angola sitting on a Human Rights Council, it's time for a new mechanism. And I think it's the same with the World Health Organization.
And I guess from a sociological perspective, there's an interesting question as to the interrelationship between the health-related stuff and the political-related stuff, right? And it sounds to me as though actually politics basically overrode what might have been the best thing to do from a health perspective.
Politics are always present at intergovernmental organizations. They've become excessive at the World Health Organization because of China's continued dominance in the top roles. I mean, let's face it, the United States is political with the way it deals with international organizations. So is the European Union. Countries that have the power to get their way generally try to use that power. The difference is the goals they pursue. The United States and European Union, while they might preference some countries over others, they might preference, for example, the US and European Union have pushed the World Health Organization to preference AIDS instead of diseases that frankly don't affect countries like the US and European Union, like river blindness. Well, that may be an inappropriate politicization of a health organization, but it's still within the remit of the organization. We can debate, should the emphasis be on AIDS or on other diseases in developing countries? Nonetheless, the focus is on curing disease. When China's in charge, that priority goes way down the list. The top priority becomes political. It becomes either saving face or getting resolutions that favor the Chinese government. The health mission really takes a back seat. And that's what we've seen with the coronavirus crisis. We've seen the World Health Organization put the political needs of China ahead of the health needs of the rest of the world.
And I guess then the last question is, with the degrading of the world order and, the fact that up until quite recently everyone thought that globalization was good and working together was good, is this another nail in the coffin for that as well, in terms of actually seeing, a degrading of those international connections?
Now, Martin, I'm a contrarian here. I think internationalism is dying a slow and maybe deserved death. Globalism is actually robust and advancing. When you have an organization that has 200 countries as members, that may be in some way admirably international, but it's not really very global in that it's a country by country organization. What we're seeing is, for example, health moving from being the remit of a formal organization like the World Health Organization to being the remit of informal alliances. I mean, the most famous being the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but all of the other kinds of alliances of NGOs that work together globally to address health issues. And not just in health, but in domain after domain of human endeavor. We see networks coming together to perform functions globally that used to be the remit of international organizations. I mean, just think of how important is the International Telecommunications Union to the governance of the internet. Not very much, right? The internet is globalism. The ITU is the old internationalism. The ITU regulates telegraphs, telephones, even communications satellites. But it plays a very tiny role in determining how the internet works. Now, you may think that's good or bad. Frankly, as much as I have complaints about the likes of Google, Apple, Twitter, Facebook, I'd rather see them running my communications than the United Nations. We can debate that. But I think on balance, it's a good thing. Of course, it has its own threats, and we see a new range of threats emerging with the advance of globalism. But we're not going to see a real pulling back from globalization. If anything, what we're going to see is the dismantling of that old international order and a doubling down on globalism and globalization.
Well, I really appreciate your time, and you've certainly given a lot of food for thought there in terms of not only what has happened historically, but actually also forward-looking, because I think I agree with you that the new shape of the world order is going to be quite different from what we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years, and we probably haven't seen anything yet.
Well, I think we're already seeing it, and we've seen it really for the last 10 or 12 years. Since the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, things have really been taking shape. What the coronavirus has done has been crystallize it, so that now we see that we're living more and more of our lives online. Now, that was happening. The transition was happening. Now we see, bang, it has happened. And we're now living this new order. Look, the travel restrictions are going to be lifted. Eventually, trade's going to return to normal. But that part of our lives, the physical world, is going to become a kind of legacy reality, as the important thing becomes the global online lives that we all increasingly live.
Yeah. Well, we better put this out on the network as soon as we can. Appreciate your time today. Thank you so much. And always really enjoyed speaking with you about this subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you.